Really interesting this week. I mean, it's always interesting. We left off that David had invaded enemy countries to make sure that all the enemy countries that repeatedly attacked over the years would be subdued so that when his son, not yet born, the son who would build the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, would be born, that would be Solomon, Shlomo. And when the day would come that Shlomo would build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, he would be able to reign throughout his entire monarchy. All the years he'd be king, he'd have peace. Just as David prepared for his son all the parts to building the Beit HaMikdash, the gold and the silver and the brass and the workers and the lumber, and he also prepared to make peace, have peace everywhere. And we learned that. So he's got peace. But it turns out there was one loose piece. And that's what chapter 10, Parakut, is about. And I always try to learn lessons, not just to study Tanakh Bible with you, just for the purpose of an interesting book, which it is. That's why you keep coming. But there's so much to be learned from it and applied to the modern era. Maybe 2 years ago, it would have been a little bit more dicey to try to apply that to what's going on. But nowadays, tragically, because of the wars with Gaza and Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria as a conduit between Iran and Lebanon and Hamas and Iran itself and Iraq, and it's a seven-front war. It's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's Hamas, it's the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, the so-called Palestine Authority. There is no Palestine. It's Judea, Samaria. There's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Iran. Six-front war. Can you think of the seventh front? The Houthis in Yemen. Israel's at war with seven sides. It's like what we're learning in the Tanakh. There's Aram, and there's Moav, and there's Ammon, and we have a history of being able to survive seven nations. If that's God's will, seven nations are not a challenge. And if it's not God's will, then God forbid, all it takes is Babylonia. All it takes is one nation. But if it's God's will, he makes miracles. And I was telling you before the election in America, Israel would withstand no matter what attack from whatever side, if that is God's will. And there is reason to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has not brought us to this point to let it not go all the way. There's a very strong sense among many of the believers, myself included, the teaching of Chief Rabbi Herzog from about 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. Chief Rabbi Yitzchak Herzog was the chief rabbi during the Holocaust. He was in Palestine. That Palestine there was, that's the Roman name for the mandate before 1948. Since 1948, there's no Palestine. No such thing as Palestinian Arabs. They're Arabs who live in Israel. And Israel has the same name. Palestine is another name for Israel. Just like Thailand is another name for Siam. The king of Siam and King and you look up Siam, they changed their name to Thailand. Palestine became Israel again. Anyway, advisors to Chief Rabbi Herzog said, you should get out of here. You should go to America. You should get out of here. We'll help you get out, because Hitler's armies under Rommel were coming up through Egypt and were going for Palestine. And there was no doubt that if Rommel got into Eretz Israel, one of his targets was going to be the chief rabbi of the Jews. And Rav Herzog said, I'm not leaving, because the Tanakh, the Bible, speaks only of two destructions and exiles. Twice there would be a Churban under the Babylonians and later under the Romans, which is post-biblical. And there will not be a third exile. He was adamant about it. He would not leave. And here we are, it was more than 75 years later, and it's a thing. 7 countries. There were 5 countries that invaded in 1948, and what we've been through in the past, and so it is now. And so it was in the time of David and Shlomo. They were out to get us. And with God's help, we subdued them, as we do now. And we now see, after Tuesday, a little bit more about what God's current plan seems to be. I have no doubt, no matter what, whether Harris wins, whether Trump wins, Israel will come out okay. The only question is, will America come out okay? After the election, you get a little bit of a vision, a little bit of a view that that's how Hashem is planning on helping Israel for the next phase, rather than outright miracles under a Harris-Biden Obama administration. It'll be a little bit more in the natural course of events. But the question is Trump's election a miracle? If you read the news, they all talk about, I'm doing this not to advance politics now, but to teach Torah and to teach God, to teach about God. If you read the media now, they all talk about all the political science reasons that Harris lost. She made this mistake, she made that mistake, Trump did this, she made this, Elon Musk put in money, this thing happened, that thing happened. It's all very logical. But when someone learns to see things through the prism, with an M at the end, of God's miracles, one sees miracles. There were many miracles. Many of the things that she did made no sense. That's what a miracle is. A miracle is something that is contrary to the natural course. Frogs come out of a water. That happens. You wouldn't have Budweiser commercials without that. But when a whole nation is overrun with frogs, it's not natural. And there are other things that happen. Locusts wipe out a nation's fruit trees once every so often. When all these things happen just at the right time, one on top of the other, you start wondering. And God puts thoughts in minds. God actually puts thoughts in your mind. Have you ever done something and looked back and said, that was a pretty good decision I made. I never realized that when I made this decision, it was going to pay off this way. But after my lung transplant, I was kind of, what am I going to do now? And what kind of classes? I can't have classes in person. Something came to mind to teach on Zoom. All right, I'll teach 4 people on Zoom. And then a lady asked me to record it, and something came in my mind to send it to her via YouTube. And next thing I know, people are watching on YouTube in a class group. Something came in my mind when I published my articles in the American Spectator or Sheva to put on the bottom a little blurb. If you'd like to come to the classes, write this address. That wasn't something I was thinking. I wasn't marketing. And one day I was driving the car. It was quiet, and the thought just came to me. Thoughts come to everybody, to you. It comes to everybody. Decisions you make in a lifetime, sometimes it's a thought that comes to your mind. And you say, boy, I was really smart that day. Or what good luck. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God puts thoughts in your mind. God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Pharaoh should have just let them go. After the 3rd or 4th or 5th plague, he had advisors saying, let them go. And he wouldn't let them go. And that's why we all know what happened. And Arafat, in 1993, came to the United States with Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak is the worst prime minister Israel ever had. He didn't even know which side he was on. And Bill Clinton, although the public wisdom, the common wisdom is that he was a friend of Israel, Bill Clinton was not a friend of Israel. And he was just better than Jimmy Carter. And Clinton had Ehud Barak, and he got Arafat, and he got Prime Minister Barak of Arafat to agree to give Arafat 96% of Judea Samaria, what they call the West Bank. And that would include East Jerusalem. And it included the Temple Mount. Barak agreed to give all of that under pressure from Clinton. And Arafat said, I want the other 4%. And that was the part of Judea Samaria that is completely populated by Jews. And there's a section in northern Israel that is completely populated by Arabs. The Galilee Triangle, it's all Arab. And Clinton persuaded Barak, who was just the worst prime minister imaginable. And he said, I'll give you that amount of square footage or kilometerage or whatever. I'll give you that amount of our Galilee, not West Bank, Judea, Samaria, but pre-1967 Israel. So you will get the full amount of territory that would be the West Bank. It'll be even better. Instead of getting this little piece of land that's going to be all Jewish populated, you'll get an equivalent amount of land that's all Arab populated. Mazel tov. And people like me, back then I was 40 years old, people like me, we were horrified. We had demonstrations against it, and we were horrified what that's going to mean. And you can look now what that would have meant. And God made a miracle. And Arafat said no. And no one understood why. And people started to understand why. God hardened his heart as God had hardened the heart of Pharaoh. It was a miracle. And through that miracle, Arafat revealed he never wanted the land. It was never about a Palestinian state. It never was about that. That was a facade. It always was about driving the Jews into the sea and destroying Israel. And a peace agreement, it never was about a peace agreement. And here we are 50 years later, and now it never was about a peace agreement. It always was about destroying Israel and removing Jews from the Arab Middle East. And that's why they would never sign it. And when he was stuck with that, he emphasized we can't make a deal unless we have the right of return that will allow 3-4 million Arabs also to come into Israel. Anyone who can claim any family connection to an Arab that lived before 1948 in that area has to have the right of return. And Israel can't allow that, or there won't be an Israel. And he knew that. And so he wouldn't take it. And the logical thing would have been for him to accept what Bill Clinton offered, because they lie anyway. They lie anyway. He should have taken what he was offered. He would have gotten this so-called Palestinian state. There is no Palestine. And you wait 10, 20 years, and then you start a new war to get the rest of it with a stronger position. You're sovereign with, you have like Gaza, and you have like Lebanon. You become like Hezbollah and like Hamas. You have an all army, and you have rockets and missiles, and you have a whole army. And now you drive the Jews in the sea. And God hardened his heart and made him stupid. And he wouldn't take half of it. He wouldn't do it. So this is the way. And this is how you look at things. Now, what happened on Tuesday, whether you like Trump or you hate Trump, there were miracles. He turned his head just as the bullet was flying. She picked Walls instead of Shapiro. It made no sense. She's really, honestly, she's not an anti-Semite. She's not that much of an anti-Semite. Honestly, She's married, even though he's a self-abnegating Jew, goes with his wife to church on Easter. She did marry the guy. She knows he's a Jew. Not that anti-Semitic. Why didn't she pick Shapiro? It was God. I couldn't say it then. I could say it now because I didn't know. It made no sense. What she was winning over the Arabs. She lost Michigan anyway. She would have had Pennsylvania. It's a miracle. God put stupid into her head, which is not to say that she was smart before, but there are deeper levels of stupid. And these were miracles. And we're going to learn now that David HaMelech, having created peace for his son and having subdued all the nations around Israel, he did not realize that there was still one problem that had to be solved. And it would blow up in the time of his son Solomon, Shlomo. And God made a miracle that David learned. He had to go further in war against Ammon and Moab. He had not crushed them enough. That's going to be our chapter 10. Just as Israel thought she had crushed the enemies in 1967, 1973, 1982, and 5 wars with Hamas in Gaza, we finally crushed them. And then October 7 of a year ago, learned they're still not crushed enough. And the same with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're still not crushed enough. And ultimately, it took a horrible, horrible tragedy, but Israel needed to have the opportunity to do what she has been doing the past year. And it's not done yet. And it seems Kadosh Baruch Hu has blessed the Jewish people in Israel by bringing in someone who we'll find out. He may turn out to be horrible, but early indications are we're going to be replacing Blinken with the likes of maybe a Marco Rubio, who's incredibly pro-Israel, and maybe having a replacement of the current Israel ambassador with Mike Huckabee, who's incredibly pro-Israel. These are miracles. And he's got the third one, replacing the UN ambassador with Stefanik, who's become an incredible hero in the Jewish world ever since those hearings with the anti-Semitic, and those were anti-Semites, those university presidents. So let's see what happened in chapter 10. The second war with Ammon and Moab. And for this, I have to remind you, we learned in earlier class, is a Torah commandment. You're never allowed to make peace with the nation of Ammon, nor with the nation of Moab. We learned this many times in Rambam in our Thursday night class about the ethics and values of Jews at war. And we're reminded now, by Torah law, not based on political science, not based on strategy, by God's command, you're not allowed, the Jewish people are not allowed ever to make peace with Ammon and Moab. And David does something, and here we go. Just thank you so much for being here. Rabbi Dov Fischer of Young Israel of Orange County. And if you like what you learn, please give us a like on YouTube. Apparently there's something good about the likes. And as I always say, if you don't like it, give us a not like, because we don't care. Here we go. Deuteronomy 23, Perek Gimel of Sefer Devarim. God says, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Lo yavo Ammoni uMoavi b'kahal Hashem. An Ammonite and a Moabite may never marry into the Jewish people. The Talmud teaches this does not apply to females. Ammoni v'lo Ammonia, Moavi v'lo Moavia. And that is why it was permitted to convert Ruth. Ruth, the Moabitess, who converts in the famous book of Ruth, marries Boaz, and actually David HaMelech descends from her. How could Ruth have been accepted as a convert? You're not allowed to accept converts. If an Ammonite or a Moabite comes to a rabbi and says, I would like to convert to Judaism, not allowed to accept them. It's very tricky, huh? When you're the rabbi, had a situation with we don't know who the Ammonites and Moabites are anymore. They're long gone. Those nations are history. But there are issues that come up sometimes where someone wants to convert and a rabbi knows you just can't take them in for any of various reasons. Not biblical per se, but practical. And it's very, very tricky. And usually you try to pass them on to someone else, and pretty much all rabbis know that you can't take that guy, and eventually they give up. And if they don't give up, you send them to the rabbinical council, and there at least you have a whole big committee turns them down. Certain people can't come in. Let's just say, for example, mentally ill. It's not a Torah law that you can't accept a mentally ill person, but you can't take in mentally ill people. It's like you can't do that. You have to send them for therapy and care. And if they're able to gain a certain amount of mental health and stability, but otherwise you cannot take in mentally ill people because you don't even know that they know what's really motivating their conversion. They're like, and there are people, I've met people who've been through 5 or 6 different religions. They've been through pretty much every denomination of Christianity. Some have stopped off at Islam for 1 or 2, Shiite, Sunni. Absolutely have to go to India and find 2 or 3 gurus to meditate with. And like, we're the 8th stop. It's like the IRT train in the New York subway till you finally get to your final destination. And some of them, their final destination is suicide. And you can't just go around taking people and converting them. So not supposed to take in an Ammonite or a Moabite. It's Torah law. And this is very pertinent, of course, to what we're learning today. Here we go. Every time we come back, there's a floating panel I have to take down. It's just one of these days, so hopefully figure that out. So, and that's because the Torah reminds us, because they did not give you bread or water on your way out of Egypt en route to the promised land. And the Moabites hired Bil'am, the evil prophet, to come and bring a curse. And it goes on. And the key pasuk here, Lo tidrosh shlomam v'tovatam kol yamecha le'olam. You may not seek their peace, their well-being. Check up on them and make sure they're okay. V'tovatam, and they're good. You should not concern yourself with more than concern. You should not seek their welfare or benefit. Kol yamecha le'olam, as long as you live. That doesn't mean if there's no war with them that you have to perpetually go to war against them to wipe them out. That's only Amalek, the Amalekites. With them, just as long as they're leaving you alone, you leave them alone. Don't get involved with them. Okay. Chapter 10. Vayhi achreichen, where we left off in the text was David HaMelech brought in Mephibosheth. David now had peace. He had invaded and destroyed all the enemy nations, and he put out the word. Are there any survivors from the house of Saul and the house of Jonathan? And he was told there actually is a survivor. By now, Saul is dead. The 3 of his sons who went to war with him against the Philistines were killed at war. His one surviving son, Ishbosheth, had become king temporarily and was assassinated. Is there anyone left? And he was told there is a son of Jonathan who became lame, was crippled at a young age. We learned about that. The nurse had been fleeing at the time of the Philistine War, and she fell with the baby in such a way that she broke the baby's bones in a way that the baby's bones were not reset, and he grew up unable to walk. Mephibosheth. And we learned that David gave instructions to bring Mephibosheth, who was in hiding unsure of David's intentions. Will he be taking revenge against the house of Saul because grandfather Saul tried to kill him all those years? Or will he be repaying Jonathan's good and his love, his brotherly love of Jonathan? And he learns, David says, find him, bring him forth. And David calls out Siva, the major domo of the house of Saul, and commands Siva, you are to work Saul's fields. He's dead, but the house of Saul, you're to work their fields and grow their grain and their fruit and make bread. And you are to feed Mephibosheth all the days of his life. And on top of it, every day, Mephibosheth is to be brought. You are to bring him to the palace to sit with the king at the king's table. And we went through the king's table, and we even looked at what happens at Queen Elizabeth's table. And that's where we left off. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate regularly at the king's table, and he was lame. So everything's done. There's peace. Everything is set up for Shlomo to build the Beit HaMikdash. Now, if they would have television, all David would have to do the rest of his life is play the harp and watch TV. I mean, all the problems are solved. The economy is great. Everything is done. HaKadosh Baruch Hu never leaves us with nothing to do. And it's up to us to take advantage of spare time to do righteousness, good deeds, and mitzvot, fulfill his commandments. Because one way or another, our time will be filled. And if it's not filled with good stuff, it can be filled with bad stuff. One of the worst things in the world is when people have too much time on their hands. We see it in the inner cities when the boys raised in homes without fathers and without adequate education have nothing to do, and they go around and they get sucked into gangs and become criminals and end up statistics in the prisons. And that's why it's so important to always be engaged and involved in productive things. You're allowed to take a break, have a vacation, and you're allowed to enjoy yourself, but you have to do good things, and you have to be occupied with them. So David, he's now got no problems. Everything's good. Let's remind ourselves this is the land of Israel. It's one country. It has not yet been divided. And our enemies, all of whom apparently have been subdued, are next door on the other side. Today it would be called Jordan, and it would be called Syria, and it would be called Gaza. It's okay. Aram, Ammon, Ammonites, Moav, Moabites, Edomites, Arameans, I think they're called. Okay. Why aren't they called Aramites? Why aren't Michigan people called Michiganders? Called Michiganders. Okay. And the king of Ammon died. And his son Hanun became king. It's the king of Ammon. King of Ammon died. Do you remember who he was? We learned about it, and now we'll refresh our memories. Bamidbar Rabbah, that's part of the Midrash, number 14. And we're going to remind ourselves who this guy was, the king of Ammon. David said somewhere in the Psalms, Moav Sirach at sea, the land of Moab is like a boiling kettle of water. Imagine a kettle of water. What's that about? The Midrash tells us, and we learned this, and we're going to refresh our memories. Back in the days when King Saul was trying to kill David, pursuing him, and David was fleeing On one occasion, he fled to Moab. Do you remember that? He left the land of Israel because it wasn't safe anywhere. He went to Moab and he brought his family because he knew and feared that Saul would kill out his entire family, God forbid. His parents, his siblings. So he brought his entire family with him to Moab. He brought his father and mother to the king of Moab. Because he feared Saul. And he had trust in Moab. Why did he trust Moab of all places? Why does he go to Moab? I've been showing you the other map. I'll stick with that. Why does he go to Moab? Well, there's Jerusalem. And so Moab is nearby, only across the Jordan River. But it's not that easy to get across, but he's fleeing for his life. Why doesn't he go to Ammon or Aram or Edom? Why does he go to Moab? He goes to Moab because he descends from Ruth. She was his progenitor. So Hayaboter Bahem Lefisha Haya Merut Hamoaviyah, because he descends from Ruth, the Moabites. Hadahu Tichtiv Vayelech David Misham Mitzpeh Moab. And it said, we learned it, that David, 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 3, he went to Moab. Vayomer el Melech Moab Yetzei Na'avi ve'imo itchem. He said to the king of Moab, may my father and mother stay with you. Arasher eda maya aseli elokim. Until I know what transpires, what God unfolds to transpire in terms of Saul trying to kill me. So I don't intend for my mom and dad to stay in your country forever. But in the meantime, can they have temporary sanctuary? The Omer, and the same chapter, next verse, the king said, and the king approved. The king said, okay, let's refresh our memories again. 1 Samuel 22. Everyone who was in the straits and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was desperate joined David. This is when he built up his ragtag battalion army to help fend off Saul, and he became their leader. There were about 400 men. We've learned about that. David then, now having an army to stand up to Saul, went to Mitzvah of Moab, and he said to the king, let my father and mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. So what ended up happening, he led them to the king of Moab. Who led them? God and Moab and David, by God's implanting the thought in God and David's wisdom. Led them to the king of Moab. They stayed with him as long as David remained in the stronghold. But then the prophet Shmuel was not there, but there was another prophet, God. Every so often you will meet someone named God. And if you don't know this, it sounds strange. They would name him G-O-D, a Jewish, what kind of arrogance would a Jewish family name his son? But actually the name G-A-D or Gimel Daled, God, is a Hebrew name. A prophet, Navi, was God. God said to him, don't stay in that stronghold. Go at once to the territory of Yehuda. So David went back to Yehuda. And that's when Saul heard that David and the men were with him had been located back in Judea. And that led to another confrontation, but that's not our focus for this now. So David had left his father and mother and brothers, his siblings, in Moab. So Ulachach Kra'o Seir. So why did David in the Psalm later refer to Moab as a boiling kettle? Ma basar metakel basir, because just as meat boils and boils and boils in boiling water in a pot, in a cauldron, kach nit aklu sham. So it was that his family was boiled. Moab became a cauldron for his family. Shaharaga melech Moab, because the king of Moab, after David left, killed his parents and his siblings. And only one survivor, a single brother of David, survived. Shabarach Etzel Nachash Melech Bnei Ammon. His one surviving relative, a brother, fled Moab as they were killing out the whole house of David and came into Ammon. Again, he fled from Moab to the adjacent country adjoining Ammon. He made it to Ammon, to King Nachash. Shabarach Etzel Nachash Melech Bnei Ammon. He fled to Nachash, the king of Ammon. Vishalach Melech Moav acharav. And when the king of Moab heard, we extinguished and exterminated the house of David, with one exception. One brother of his made it into neighboring Ammon. The king of Moab sent emissaries to Nachash, king of Ammon, saying, please send that kid back. We've got some unfinished business. V'lo ratzah litno, and King Nachash refused to give him away, give him back. He provided him with sanctuary. V'hu ha'chesed she'asa Nachashim David. And this was the kindness that Nachash, the Ammonite, did for David. Okay. Ulefichach nitgara im haMoavim. And because of this, when David finally established his kingship, his monarchy, and was in the final stage of destroying all these surrounding enemies, he made it his business to wipe out the Moabites. And we learned that a few weeks ago, how he laid them down and took like a rope or string and measured. By Amadadem Bachevel, Ashkevotam Arza. Do you remember he measured them? In those days, they did not have, let's say, rulers, measurement rulers. And so he used rope. And he measured Shnei Chavelim Lahamid, Umelo Chavel Hachayot. And based on the measuring rope, he made all the army of the Moabites lie down like sardines, one near the next, near the next, near the next. He measured them by a long outstretched rope, tied to a rope, tied to a rope, tied to a rope, because no one makes that large a rope. And then he measured off 2/3, and he killed them. He had 2/3 executed and allowed 1/3 to live. So we go back now. Again, Moav destroyed his family. King Nachash allowed his family to live, but you're not allowed to seek the peace of Moab or Ammon, right? Let's find that again. You're not allowed to seek the peace of Moab or Ammon. No Ammonite or Moab shall be admitted. Lo tidrosh, never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. So what about the idea that, but come on, I mean, okay, we're supposed to ignore them and stay away from them and have nothing to do with them. But the king of Ammon saved your brother's life. So you don't say thank you. It's kind of awkward, huh? So what ends up happening, going back to this, David, when he hears that the king of Ammon died, and Hanun, his son, look, they don't sit Shiva the way we Jews do based on Torah law, that we sit, God forbid, sit Shiva. For 7 days, a person does not leave his home or her home. Any immediate relative, if someone's father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, or spouse, God forbid, dies, their surviving relative must sit Shiva. The word Shiva is from Shiva, 7. They must stay inside 7 days, with the exception, an exemption for Shabbat. Jews don't sit Shiva on Shabbat. So that day, at least not publicly, laws of Shiva apply in the house on Shabbat, but a person still goes outdoors to shul on Shabbat. And for 7 days, there are all these laws. it's famous, that custom of covering the mirrors, but more importantly, there's one does not wear shoes, is barefoot, and sits on a lower chair, and people come to offer divrei tanchumim, condolences, and Kaddish is recited, and a 7-day candle is lit, and there are all these laws of Shiva. And it's called sitting Shiva, God forbid. And it's a big mitzvah to pay a Shiva visit. That's how we say it in English, to pay a Shiva visit, or to pay a Shiva call, to go to the house of Shiva and to express one's condolences. It's a big mitzvah to pay a Shiva call. And we can go into that so much more. Maybe one day we will on the Thursday night class when we're done with the laws of war, and we do some other halacha. So maybe the Ammonites don't sit Shiva, but they have their own form of mourning. And David wanted to extend condolences. You're not supposed to seek the peace of the nation. That's a Torah law. You may not seek the peace of Ammon, but to go to one Ammonite and express condolences, maybe that's allowed. So David said, I'm going to do a kindness with Hanun, the son of that wonderful King Nachash, who saved my family, my brother. Ka'asher asa aviv imadi chesed. Just as his father, Nachash, when alive, did kindness to me, namely in saving the life of my brother. So David sent emissaries to Ammon to offer tanchumim, nachamim, to offer condolences. Biyad Avadav El Aviv. He sent some of his servants to the father of Nachash, namely Hanun. Vayavo Avdei David Eretz Bnei Ammon, and the servants of David, his emissaries, came to the land of Ammon to pay a Shiva call, so to speak. Vayomru Sarei Bnei Ammon El Hanun Adonehem, and the officers, the high-ranking officials closest to the inner cabinet of King Hanun, their lord, they said to him, you think they're coming to pay respects, to offer condolence? Are you kidding? I was going to say, are you crazy? But you wouldn't talk to your king lord that way. Are you kidding? Hamachabed David et avicha ve'einecha, hishalach lecha menachamim. You think David's coming to give kavod, honor, to avicha, your father, ha'av shalcha, ve'einecha, in einayim shalcha, before your eyes? Think he's coming to honor your father before your eyes? Kishalach lecha menachamim, that he's sending condolences? No, that's not what this is about. We are your trusted advisors to protect you, King Hanun. So we're telling you, halo ba'avorcha kor et ha'ir, uleragla ulahafcha, sholach David et avadav elecha. Rather, David has sent his servants into this land for the purpose of spying the city, to spy meragel, meraglim, leragla, to spy ulahafcha, and to hefech, to turn it upside down. He's planning to go to war. He's planning to finish the wars that he's been making. And he already has had a certain amount of achievement. And now he's sending foot soldiers to spy out where next to attack. So we advise you to treat them as enemy spies, not as welcome visitors. And Vayikach Hanun, King Hanun, the son of King Nachash, accepted and adopted that advice, and he took the emissaries via Galach et Chatziz Kanam, and at each of them he had their beards cut in half. Let's try to imagine you have a long beard. He didn't cut the beard halfway this way. He didn't cut it with a horizontal cut. He did a vertical cut. So you've got a nice big beard, and he cut one side of the beard. He left them, left or right, I don't know. He left the right half of the beard all the way down, and the left half was like clean shaven. That would be extreme shame. There are certain societies where everybody wears a beard. There are certain societies like where they wear turbans, like in certain Muslim societies. Sikhs have extremely long hair. People don't know it because it's under the turban, but it's one of their 5 rituals. They're supposed to carry a little knife. There are 5 rituals for Sikhs, Sikh, the ones from India. And in the Middle East, among Jews, I mean, when you think of a rabbi, there are plenty of clean-shaven rabbis, but like if you were an artist painting a painting of a rabbi, he would have a beard. He would be a he, because halakha does not allow women rabbis, which is a whole other story, maybe for another Thursday night. When you hear about reform women rabbis, how can that be? Reform. How could it be? How could it be? Well, okay. So a rabbi is a man, and the tradition is a rabbi has a beard. I have a short beard, but I have a beard. I have a beard. It's short. It's definitely enough to scratch the knees. But it's short. But you just don't see clean-shaven rabbis. You do occasionally. You know where you saw them? From the 1920s to the 1960s. For 40 years, Orthodox rabbis, other than Haredim, what is disrespectfully called the ultra-Orthodox, I don't like that term, Haredim rabbis would have beards. Haredi rabbis would have beards. But a lot of the modern Orthodox rabbis were clean-shaven. It was a time that we had just come from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and trying to fit into this new world, and everybody's clean-shaven. And there's already plenty of anti-Semitism up to the wazoo anyway. Law firms won't let you be a lawyer, and they won't hire doctors, and they won't let you in their hotels, and they won't rent to you, and they won't let you into college. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in America. Every Jew in America should at least once in a lifetime see the movie. I've seen it like 6 times. Gentleman's Agreement, starring Gregory Peck. At least once in a lifetime, Gentleman's Agreement. That's what America was for Jews from 1920 to 1960. And in that world, even Orthodox rabbis shaved. Now, the idea of shaving, how did this even start, one way or the other? Because the Torah says you're not allowed to apply a razor to your face that would destroy, the word is destroy. You're not allowed to destroy the 5 corners of your face. What does that mean? The Talmud and the rabbi commentators explain, here are the 5 corners of your face. The 2 temples, the 2 jawbones, and the Kirk Douglas cleft. You remember Kirk Douglas had that like gigantic cleft, like a big deep pit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're not allowed to cut with a razor those 5 sections such that you completely make it clean shaven. So all rabbis, modern Orthodox also, if there even was modern in 1920, had beards. And then, was it Thomas Edison of blessed memory? I don't know. For all I know, he was an anti-Semite. But in this small way, for sure, blessed memory, invented or discovered electricity. And they started applying electricity to different things. And someone even figured out eventually how to make an electric shaver. Not in 1920. In 1920, though, they had come up with a depilatory cream, sort of like those commercials on TV for Nair, N-A-I-R, with the women showing off their legs, and buy the Nair cream, and it'll take all the hair off the legs. The Orthodox Jews knew that they're not allowed to use a razor blade completely to be clean shaven. Technically, you could have a little bit of, you're not allowed to do it here, here, and here. Technically, you could have a little hair growing, but that looks ridiculous. If your goal is not to encounter anti-Semitism, you walk around like that. The only way to get around with that, you have to wait 70 years till Star Trek and you can tell them you're a Klingon. You can't walk around like that. So everybody would apply Nair. Whatever the name of the company would have been back there. They would have applied depilatory creams, and that's how all the Orthodox men lived in America from 1920 to 1960. The depilatory used by women on their legs, that's what did to be clean shaven, because you can't use a razor. And then eventually they discovered electric razors, shavers. And rabbinic authorities ruled, most of them, not all of them, most of them ruled you're allowed to use them because you're allowed to use scissors. You're not allowed to use a single blade that completely eradicates the hair, making it clean shaven. But you're allowed to use the scissors. And that way you get the Yasser Arafat look, where he was never clean shaven and he never had a beard. And he always had 3 days growth. And you were allowed to do that, but you don't want to look like Yasser Arafat. Even before there was a Yasser Arafat, you're trying to get a job in America. And they're already anti-Semitic, and there's nothing worse than looking like you're not shaved properly. For a man to show up for a job interview at work with a 2-day, 3-day shadow, you get fired. Disney, you have to be clean shaven. I think maybe they're changing some of it, but like you couldn't get a job in Disney with a beard. And that wasn't only for Jews. So being clean shaven was a big thing. And so they used depilatory cream, and nobody liked that. And then when electric shavers came and the rabbis were asked, the rabbis had experts explain to them how the electric shaver works, because it's more involved than just plugging it in. And the way an electric shaver works actually is that there are conflicting or opposing razor blades, and they're working like that. And that's how it works. And the razor blades are picking up the thing. And so it became a thing that Orthodox men don't have to use depilatory cream. If you want to look like a non-Jew, a guy, you just use an electric shaver. And I did when I was a kid. In fact, it was a big thing when you were 13 years old, 14 years old, even if you didn't have any hair. You're an all-boys school. Oh, yeah, I use a shaver. We had one friend, Charlie, I won't even mention his last name, but Charlie couldn't grow hair. He was a few years behind the rest of us. So all of us would get together in a little clique of 8 Yankee fans and Met fans, and we would constantly, this is what yeshiva boys talk about. Oh, I'm sorry I was late, but I needed an extra. I know we were supposed to meet at 11, but I know it's 11:02, but I was shaving. So, yeah, I was shaving also, but I started 2 minutes to 11, so I'd be on time. Yeah, what shaver to use? Well, I use Remington. Oh, I use Schick. And then we would all turn. I hope God will forgive me. I've done so many Yom Kippurs since that time. We would all turn to Charlie and say, and Charlie would be looking down. And he'd say, no, I shave also. He'd say, I shave. And Simon, I still remember the expression, Charlie, nothing personal, but you have a face like a baby's tush. And that became, we put him through high school, Charlie with the face like a baby's tush, and it's just terrible. So anyway, used electric. I went to rabbinical school. By now I was about 25, give or take. I started rabbinical school, I finished college. I started rabbinical school. And a lot of the guys had beards. And I started thinking, like, what's the deal with beards? I started researching it. I wanted to know the history of how modern Orthodox rabbis came to be clean-shaven. What I've taught you now was actually the result of 3 hours of research back then. And what happened is, why did they, okay, you've got the depilatory cream and you've got the electric shaver. Why did you start doing that? Because we want to look like the Goyim. We want the Goyim to accept us. I'm using the word Goy not as a pejorative, non-Jews. We wanted the Goyim to respect us and accept us, and so we wanted to look like them. Once it was culturally appropriate in America to have a beard, Abraham Lincoln. In those days, Rutherford B. Hayes, look at the pictures of the American presidents in that time. Rutherford B. Hayes had a beard. Teddy Roosevelt had something going on. And then it stopped around the time. William Howard Taft had it. And then around Woodrow Wilson, it stopped. Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Ike, JFK, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama. All of a sudden, nobody had beards. It no longer was good practice to have a beard. So we wanted to look like the Goyim. By the time I was going into rabbinical school in the 80s, we had undergone a Jewish renaissance of pride. And for this, we have two people to thank, two types, the blacks and Hispanics. The idea that blacks were going out with black pride. We're proud. We're black. And Hispanics, Jews were changing their names. I have a Hebrew name, Dov, and my English name, David, and I went by David. And all the Jews are born with a Hebrew name and an English name, male and female, and we all go by the English name. So we should fit in. Our resume, our job interview, and then in the 70s and 80s, you had all these Julios and Juan, and started thinking, it's safe to use your Hispanic name. So what are we hiding? Why are we more ashamed to be called Dov and Shlomo than to be called Julio and Juan and Enrico and Ricardo? So we all start, that's when I changed. I took on the name Dov, which was what my mom and dad gave me. And I changed it from David. And I changed it. Everybody knows me as Dov. And like all my friends, we all started growing beards. Whether you had a really closer beard, because I just find it uncomfortable, or you have a long beard, it became, we're not going to feel we have to look like the Goyim. We're going to grow a beard. We're going to go back to stop hiding. And it's also the pride after the 1967 war, etc. Now, this is all, as I always go on segues, if I have halacha to teach you, or Jewish history to teach you. So that Navi is not simply, family, let's sit down tonight. Let's sit down tonight, and as the family, let's read chapter 10 of the book of 2 Samuel, which is very beautiful. I wish every American would do that. But here we're learning and using every opportunity to learn Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish law, and also the book. So when they cut those beards, all Jews had beards. And the disgrace, a Jewish man with a half beard, because you could say, so why didn't they just shave the other half? And they'd be clean shaven. They wouldn't be embarrassed. To be clean shaven as a Jew in Israel, in an all Jewish country, beard was unacceptable, embarrassing, humiliating. And therefore, what would they do? The rabbis talk about it. Why did he cut half the beard? And the rabbinic, the second part of that pasuk verse we're going to look at in a second is he also had all of their robes, all of their royal garment robes. After all, they were not just regular people, they were emissaries of the king. So they wore very dignified, probably made of silk, probably beautiful colors. They wore dignified robes the way you would expect of an emissary of the king. And the robes ran down to the floor in an elegant way, obviously not that it looks like it's the wrong size. And the king had his people take scissors or whatever they used, and they cut all the robes in half up to the person's buttocks, so that it would continue to cover from the neck and shoulders to the private parts and the buttocks, and the bottom half of the buttocks all the way down. They cut that part of the robe off. And in those days, I guess they didn't wear underwear. the way we do nowadays. I don't know. That's the implication, at least, on underpants, undershirts. And so they were sent on their way with half beards and with half their clothes and their buttocks sticking out. Imagine you all have self-dignity. I mean, I don't know what goes on in colleges, but we all have self-dignity. You want to walk in the streets with a garment and from your buttocks on down. It's even, I hope you've never been to a hospital as a patient, but even in a hospital patient, it's like, I know, it's no secret, I was in the hospital for 4 months. They put on the hospital robe, you know what it's like, and they tell you that the part that's open goes in the back, and you put on the robe and you tie the thing, and so that they can get to you. And you have to do, if you're going to be in a hospital for 4 months, you better go out 3-4 times a day and walk the halls, because otherwise you're really messed up when you get out. They'll give you lungs, but you won't have legs operational. So every day you've got to go. And the nurse always would say, Rabbi, let me just tie the bottom half of your robe. You don't want people to see your buttocks as you're walking the hallway. And I would always be very grateful for their thoughtfulness. And they do that not just because I'm a rabbi, they do it for everybody. It's not an honorable thing to be walking around with your buttocks showing. So the rabbis and the commentators talk about, was there anything deeper going on here also? Clearly he wanted to humiliate them. And the rabbis say, you know why he cut off half their beards and half their garments? Because he wasn't sure. This king, Hanun, son of Nachash, he wasn't sure. Are they coming here in good faith as honest to goodness emissaries of King David to offer condolences? Or are they coming here for spies to spy out the country and make war against us? I'm not sure. So I'll impose on them half a humiliation, which of course is ultimately a full humiliation. It's not like a half full, half empty cup of water. You walk around with your buttocks exposed and half a beard, that's a complete humiliation. So let's get back to the text. Covering a little bit more for today, and we'll be continuing with the commentaries. So he cut off he cut off half their beard. The word for beard in Hebrew is zakan. And interestingly, the word for an elderly person is zaken. You associate an elderly person with a white beard, the image of like a wise elderly man. In your own mind's eye, if you were that artist given a paintbrush and canvas and invited to paint a wise elderly man, he probably would come with a white beard. It's just what a wise elderly man looks like, even among non-Jews. So anyways, a Zaken, he cut off half the beard, chatzi is half, vayachrot et madveihem bechetzi, and he cut off their uniforms. It's even a contemporary word for like the Israeli army, the madavim, bechetzi. He cut half the uniform, half their royal robes, ad shtotehem, until their buttocks. Vayishalchem, and sent them back to David. Vayagidu David vayishlach likratam. And when David heard the word, he went out. He sent out other emissaries to, I don't want to say greet them, but to come to them. And the men were so humiliated that they basically went into hiding with a game plan to have to wait months until their beards would grow back. Obviously, they could come up with new clothing, but they had to wait for their beards to grow back. ad yitzamachzich anchem v'shavtem. And David's emissaries were sent to tell them, the king understands what happened. This will not go unanswered. And in the meantime, he has set aside a place in the city of Jericho. And you should stay there until your beards grow back. And we're going to, I'll just do this one more sentence and then add one more word. Vayeru b'nei, and I'm going to comment on Jericho. Vayeru b'nei Ammon ki niv'ashu b'David. And as this was unfolding, the people back at Ammon realized they just made war. They just made war. That they had incurred the wrath of David. And he's going to come after us something fierce. So we may as well line up now for war. It's coming. We may as well attack him. So remember how he had prepared everything for Solomon, Shlomo, that there's going to be peace on all the borders and a whole generation, you'll never have a nation at war? Well, not quite. Almost. And soon to be, but not quite yet. Vayishlchu b'nei Ammon, vayiskeru et Aram bet Rechov ve'et Aram tzova esrim elef ragli. Ammon was not able to fight off the anticipated attack by David. Why not? Because he just destroyed them. He had just destroyed the military oppositions posed by all the nations around in preparation for a generation of peace under Solomon. Consequently, here they made trouble for themselves and were not situated to fight back. By Iskeru at Aram Beit Rechov Aram Sova. So they hired mercenaries because they all knew they all have problems. They hired soldiers from Aram and they started hiring, we're going to have to fight them off. And so that's neighboring, right? Moav was the ones who killed his parents and siblings. The brother fled to the adjacent Ammon. And now Ammon is recruiting from Aram. And they're hiring mercenaries. So they hire the mercenaries. Let's just get that. I want to wrap it up here. That'll be this one. Okay. So they got mercenaries, 20,000 foot soldiers, and they got more mercenaries from the Arameans and the king of Macha. So they got Aram and this Aram, etc. Vayishma David vayishlach et Yoav v'et kol tzavah hagiborim. And now David heard that they're arming for war. And anyway, this cannot go unanswered. So David calls in Yoav, his chief of staff, to get ready. A final word before we break for tonight. It says that he told them to encamp in Jericho. Why Jericho? You've got a bunch of, excuse me, you've got a bunch of humiliated emissaries of King David who now have to wait for many months. The only thing I can compare it to is, God forbid, if an unmarried woman would get pregnant and the parents would send her off somewhere in a time that no one would get abortions. And so they would send a girl off for any number of months and not let the local people know what she's gone off to travel the world, or she's gone off to be with her aunt, and then she comes back a year later with the baby. And it's the same idea. They're hiding until they grow the beard back. Why Jericho? We had been commanded at the time of Joshua fighting the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. We were commanded that in memory of the miracle of the walls came tumbling down, and how the Jewish people, by God's miracle, crossed the Jordan and came finally into the promised land and took sovereignty in possession, that the first place where these miracles happened never was to be inhabited. It was to remain not only a monument where you build a statue or something, The whole city will be a monument. Jericho never shall be built. That's why they did not set up the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in Jericho, but in Shiloh. Jericho shall not be inhabited. That's actually a lifelong, a forever law. As long as there's Jews, which means until Messiah and beyond, never allowed to settle Jericho. And it was for that reason, first of all, two things. First of all, that's why David sent them to Jericho, because they wouldn't be humiliated in Jericho, because there were no Jews living in Jericho. And that's also final footnote of the night. In, I think it was 93, when Rabin made that horrific, historically disastrous Oslo Accord. And slowly but surely, before that, started making moves to give Yasser Arafat quasi-sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. You may or may not remember this, and even if you remember some of it, you may not remember all of it. But Rabin initially tested the waters by giving Arafat Jericho. And people said, what's that about? What's that about? Now, at that point, there was no Palestine Authority. There was no Palestine. And there was no Arab nothing. Pardon the double negative. And he gave him Jericho. And the analysts, many secularists couldn't figure it out. But some of the Orthodox political commentators figured it out. Rabin's argument was, you have no right, you, the nationalists, the right-wingers, the religious parties, you have no right to criticize me for giving Arafat sovereignty over Jericho, because the Bible says Jews are not allowed to be sovereign, or not allowed to live in Jericho. And look it up after class. Go Wikipedia or look it up. Rabin, Arafat, Jericho. That's why he gave them Jericho. And that's why David sent them to Jericho. I look forward to seeing you Thursday on that class, Sunday on that class, and God willing, next Tuesday as well. Again, thanks so much for being here and for inspiring me to get really into this stuff. I never learned Navi as deeply as I've been learning